Hi, I'm Lloyd Rieber, and welcome to this workshop to introduce you to Q methodology. I'm a professor of learning, design, and technology at the University of Georgia. Q is a research methodology designed to study people's subjectivity on a given topic. It's interesting and unfortunate that Q is not taught more widely across universities in the United States. This workshop is meant to provide an entry point for anyone interested in knowing what Q is, how it works, and whether it might be a good research approach for your research projects. You should note that I will be referring to frequently and largely following the text by Simon Watts and Paul Stenner titled Doing Q Methodological Research, Theory, Method, and Interpretation. This video is one of a series of videos I've made to support this workshop. Learning Q is best done by doing Q. So people who are participating in this workshop will be completing a variety of activities. So I may refer to those offline activities in these videos from time to time. I really don't think you can learn Q well enough just by watching these or other videos you may find online. However, I'm making these videos available to all who might have an interest in Q. Okay, let's begin. Okay, here's the workshop agenda. We'll begin with a brief orientation to Q. And then I'd like you to really start to learn about Q by experiencing it. So we're going to have one or more activities, a very special activity called a Q sort on a variety of topics. And the one I always like to start off with is one on food. But then we'll go from there. I teach a lot of classes at University of Georgia on educational research. So one of my favorite topics is also to have an activity on personal preferences for doing educational research. And if we have time, we'll do maybe a third on a topic that makes sense for the particular group. And based on that activity, we will then see how one actually collects data in Q, how one analyzes that Q data, and then how we actually interpret the data in order to understand the subjectivity of the people who were involved in the study. Along the way, we'll deal with some foundational philosophy, principles, and concepts. And at the end, we'll try to have a good debrief and critique both of the workshop and Q itself. Now, by the end of this workshop, you should be able to begin conducting your own Q pilot studies. I use the word pilot there on purpose because it's important to learn a methodology by actually doing it. And as you begin to do it, you'll probably make some mistakes or look back on some of those early works and see how you might do them differently. But that's how you get started. That's how you learn. Of course, you will need to study Q further to fully understand the theory and practice of it. I'll have a variety of readings I'll recommend. And there's a lot of different skills involved in Q that, of course, will demand more study and expertise as you move along. But you actually will find that doing Q allows you to understand these at an introductory level, namely factor analysis and abductive reasoning. And then you'll learn more about those and become more sophisticated in understanding them as you go. Q is a really good, I think, gateway into both quantitative and qualitative research. The originator of Q methodology is William Stevenson, and Dr. Stevenson had both a doctorate in psychology and also had a separate doctorate in physics, so a very unique individual. He was a student and collaborator of Charles Spearman, a very famous professor of statistics. You'll see Spearman's name all over the statistical literature, known for many things, but in this context, Spearman invented something called factor analysis, and William Stevenson used factor analysis, really an adaptation of it, with a lot of unique and original ideas to form Q methodology. William Stevenson also worked and was a collaborator with Cyril Burt, and you'll find that there's some interesting papers that both Stevenson and Burt co-wrote as they tried to put forward their own ideas related to this notion of Q methodology. William Stevenson's ideas actually went in a very different direction and have stood the test of time quite well, whereas Cyril Burt's unfortunately did not. So what is Q methodology? Well, here's a quote from a book that I highly recommend to anyone who is interested in learning Q for the first time by Simon Watts and Paul Stenner. They write that Q methodology is a research technique and associated set of theoretical and methodological concepts which focuses on the subjective or first-person viewpoints of its participants. They go on to write that a well-delivered Q study reveals the key viewpoints extant among a group of participants and allows those viewpoints to be understood holistically and to a high level of qualitative detail. And I think really the first thing I want to get across here that Q is a research methodology. It is therefore a complete methodology with its own philosophy and foundational principles, and it's comprised of methods, and one can choose different variations of Q when one is designing one study. And it's also a technique, and the technique is something called a Q sort. And I bring this up because a lot of people at the beginning focus very strongly on the technique of Q sorts, and they kind of begin to equate Q with the technique. But it is only, again, a technique for data collection within a very robust methodology. In fact, I really like to make the point that a Q sort is to the Q researcher what a telescope is to the astronomer. Now, if you have a backyard telescope and you enjoy viewing the skies, good for you. I mean, that's wonderful. But simply because you own a telescope and look through it and make your own observations doesn't mean that you qualify as an astronomer who might work at a university. There's a lot of obviously background knowledge and skill that is involved in becoming an astronomer. But again, data collection is the key idea here. So how do you collect data? Well, for a Q researcher, we collect data through this thing called a Q sort. It's also really important to note at the very beginning that Q is a very unique mixed methods research approach. It involves both quantitative and qualitative skills. And you cannot do Q without this partnership between quantitative and qualitative. Oftentimes you hear about mixed methods research where it's mostly quantitative with a little bit of qualitative thrown in, or the reverse. This is a very intertwined mixed methods approach involving both factor analysis, which is the quantitative side, with a variety of subjective principles, namely subjectivity, concourse theory, self-reference, and abductive reasoning. And it's very important to point out that Q's use of factor analysis is really based on a completely different set of philosophical foundations than I would say, a typical researcher who uses factor analysis. In fact, you'll see in the Q literature, we'll be referring to those more traditional uses of statistics as R. So we have Q and we have R, and we'll compare those as we go through the workshop. But here's an example of what I'm talking about. So first of all, what is factor analysis? Well, really factor analysis is an approach to reduce the data in order to make more sense of it. So the quote here is to reduce the many individual viewpoints about a topic down to a number of factors or profiles. And I say with Q, it's kind of like turning a traditional factor analysis table sideways. So what do I mean by that? So in the traditional use of factor analysis, what we'll call R methodology, we would give a large number of people, I have a P here looking on the left-hand side, a variety of measures. And it could be, who knows how many, it might be 6, 7, might be 12, 13. And we start finding that people are performing in maybe similar ways across some of those particular measures. For example, imagine giving lots of activities that require a person to communicate with speech and text. And they seem to perform very similarly on those kinds of activities or tasks. Well, we might then say maybe there's an underlying or hidden factor or trait that might be at the cause of some of that. And so we might therefore talk about something called verbal aptitude. And so factor analysis kind of shows you through correlations which measures are all pretty much measuring the same thing. You know, another example might be if I give somebody with activities involving lots of puzzles and mysteries to solve, and they seem to perform in a very similar ways on those types of activities, maybe those activities are really pointing to this underlying trait or skill that we might call analytical reasoning. Now, in our methodology, you need lots of people, potentially hundreds of people, to actually have a valid study. Not so in Q. As you can see here on the right-hand side, the rows now are not people, but instead they are sort items. which are typically statements, but they really could be anything. They could be pictures, they could be photographs, they could be sounds, they could be smells, it could be anything. And instead of measures going across the columns, we have people. So we're going to have a lot of statements that we are going to start to compile, and then we are going to sample those statements and then give those statements to a fairly small number of people, relatively speaking, who we will ask to sort. And the result will be a very similar kind of analysis where we're going to see, well, how many different clusters of people seem to be sorting these statements in similar ways. And so you wind up with clusters of people that we then need to try to figure out, well, how can we describe what that cluster of individuals, what their viewpoints are? All right, so that's kind of the fundamental difference between an R methodology use of factor analysis and a Q methodology use of factor analysis. The sort items, again, usually statements, are sorted using a very special kind of grid. And here's an example of a typical Q-sort grid. Now, a Q-sort grid can take different shapes. It can be maybe more narrow and taller, or it might be wider and shorter, but it's always going to have this symmetrical kind of shape. And this should actually remind you of something, namely a normal curve. And in fact, if I invert the normal curve, you get this this kind of classic shape where you have very few statements on the left and the far right, and you have lots more in the middle. So each statement could go in one and only one of those grid boxes. Okay, well, let's just kind of cut to the chase here. Here is my little pocket guide to Q methodology. So first, you will need to identify a topic for your research and write a research question. Second, you have to create a concourse for the topic. And a concourse is going to be defined much more precisely later on in the workshop. But basically, if you think about any particular topic that people might be talking about, what are all the different views that people are expressing about that particular topic? So in a sense, it could be theoretically an infinite number of ways of talking about a particular topic. But usually it's going to be, 1, 2, 300 statements that might be compiled. And you're going to then you will want people to be able to sort those statements, but obviously we can't ask somebody to sort 300 statements. So we're going to pick a sample from that concourse and use that sample in our Q-sort. Now that sample has to be representative in a fair and balanced way from the concourse, obviously. And then we're going to obviously identify participants, and we'll talk about how we might identify those individuals, and we will conduct the Q-sort with the participants. Now, it's kind of interesting, by the way, we compared R with Q, and in typical R research, we have a population of people, and we can't ask the entire population, let's say, of all of the principals in all of the schools of Georgia to participate in a research study, but we might then do a very careful sampling of those principals. As it turns out, that's analogous to the idea of the concourse, that we are going to do a sample of the statements in the concourse. In a way, like the concourse in a Q study is like the population, and we're going to pick a sample then from that concourse. Now, we're going to then, after we have the participants run or conduct the Q-sort, and we collect their Q-sort data, we then run factor analysis to identify those distinct viewpoints among the participants, and then we have to interpret the viewpoints. Now, we might want more data than just the Q-sorts, so we are going to be applying in very strategic ways lots of qualitative types of data gathering as well, such as talking to the participants, maybe asking them to do a think aloud as they do the Q-sort, having an interview with them after the Q-sort, maybe having focus groups based on the factors that emerge. So there's a variety of ways that we can collect more data to help with the interpretation. The interpretation is one of the most difficult things in Q. Well, let's dive into this thing called Q methodology by actually doing it. So let's find a very good topic for our very first Q-sort, and I've spent a lot of time and effort thinking about what is a good first Q-sort topic, and I'm still not sure I have found it. but I think we can come up with possible topics if we think about what is important in the worlds around us. And here are just some examples of some very serious topics that I think people have been talking about. For example, what are your views on legalizing marijuana? That is a very popular and important topic now in the United States. It continues to be an important topic about the question what actually happened at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. What is your view of racial and social injustice in America? What are your views on taking down Confederate monuments? I live here in the southern portion of the United States, and that's been a very heated topic in this area. How seriously do you take the COVID-19 pandemic? Do masks work? And why do people not want to get, the vaccines? Now, those are all very important topics, and I think would be ones that would be good for us to pursue. But let's kind of keep this light, and let's make the first Q sort one that we can just have a little bit of fun with, and just kind of see, very quickly how this thing called a Q sort works and how we begin to do the analysis interpretation in Q. So I think everybody I know has one thing in common, and that is they like to eat. So our topic will be preferred foods. I think it's very important that we conduct our very first Q sort in its traditional print-based form. And I love this little image that I have found that kind of shows the essence of doing a Q sort, where you have the Q sort grid and cards, and you have to sort those into the grid. Now, I'm a technology guy. I've even built an app for collecting Q sort data, but I actually am a very strong believer that the very first Q sort should be in its traditional print-based form. It's much more intuitive, and there's a certain tactile, just that feel to it that I think is just so important. And once you understand how it works in the paper-based format, I think it's then very easy to move to online approaches. And we'll do some critiquing of online versus print as we do this and later on in the workshop. However, I would like everyone to go ahead now and download my Q sort tool titled creatively Lloyd's Q sort tool by going to my website noahroad.com/qsort, and we'll be using it for the remaining Q sorts in the workshop. My app is available on both the Macintosh and Windows computer systems. It does not work on mobile devices, nor does it work on Chromebooks. Okay, this concludes this first video. You will now complete the Q sort on food preferences. And the next video, we will take a look at how to analyze that data using a tool called KenQ. I'll be actually using the desktop edition, KenQ Analysis Desktop Edition, also just known as CADE. And you can feel free to go ahead and get this tool yourself. It is free, and I'll provide the link to you. Although there are several statistical packages available for analyzing Q data, my preference and my recommendation is the KenQ tool. Okay, until next time.